Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you are all well. So in the last video, I used these miniature Terrazzo sprinkles and I said I'm going to try them in epoxy resin. That is what we're doing today. We're making some absolute gorgeousness. Let's go. So the resin I'm using in this video is Vista Turbo. This is their fast curing resin, around 5 hours to demold. And I'm just using it because I'm a little bit lazy and I want things done quickly. These gorgeous pendant molds were from Amazon. I've had them a couple of years, but if I can find them, I will link them down below in my storefront. And I'm also using the neon powders by Resin Pro. These are the same powders that I purchased to use in the several previous videos before this one. So after mixing my resin, I do mix my resin for a solid 5 minutes to make sure that both parts A and B are fully combined with no issues. I'm pouring in my Terrazzo chips. Now, I have never combined Terrazzo chips and epoxy resin. I've done Jesmonite and epoxy resin, but I've not done this. So I didn't quite know which way to do it. I decided to pack them in. Pack them in as if I were creating a Jesmonite Terrazzo piece. And I figured that the more I pack in there, the more impact they will have in the final pieces. What I'm going to do now, after I've mixed them in and I'm super happy with the level of saturation, I'm going to put my cup of resin to one side to allow those air bubbles to surface before moving on to my Jesmonite. The tricky thing is here, using Vista Turbo, because it's a fast cure resin, you kind of want to you don't want to leave it too long sitting in a cup, around about 20 minutes max, I would say, because there is a risk of it going exothermic or flash curing in the cup. So I knew I was time limited when it came to moving on to the Jesmonite. And because I want to pour them wet with wet, you kind of can't do your Jesmonite first because by the time you've mixed your resin, the Jesmonite would be dry. But I mean, either way works. I'm just mixing up a batch of the Jesmonite AC100 and I'm splitting it into 5 different cups. I'm making a mess, granted, but it's okay. You can't actually be creative without making a mess. Each cup is going to get an individual colour and these are just beautiful pigments. Honestly, I've fallen head over heels in love with these neons. First colour up is this gorgeous pink and I mix it until they are completely combined and I'm happy. Next colour up is the stunning neon yellow. This is the colour that super popped in the last video. Next colour up is the green and then the next colour up is that corally orange. I actually decided to add the 5th cup was going to be the yellow, so I did make 2 yellows. My main aim for these pendants was that it was going to be a half and half or 2/3, 1/3 situation, and I'm just adding my Jesmonite colours to the tips of the pendants and I'm using a cocktail stick to go in and around those 90-degree edges to dislodge any air bubbles. I am going really slowly, but I'm also aware that my Jesmonite could cure on me at any second, so there's this kind of slow fastness going on, if that makes sense. I'm just pouring in my Jesmonite Terrazzo chips and adding a little bit of that clear resin until I am really happy with the filled upness of my pendant. I also do add back some Jesmonite yellow to the top because I feel like in this one in particular, the resin was kind of more than I wanted it to be. So I do end up going in now and adding back in some of that yellow Jesmonite. Now, I have done videos on my channel in the past using using Jesmonite and epoxy resin. So if you are new here and you have any questions on whether these two different components will combine and stick together, I've already done videos on it, but there are 2 main things that you need to remember. The first and most important thing that you need to remember if you are trying to do a Jesmonite and epoxy resin combination is that resin sticks to Jesmonite. Jesmonite does not stick to resin. Okay, epoxy resin will pretty much stick to absolutely everything, including things that you don't want it to stick to, but once resin has cured, Jesmonite is not strong enough. It does not have the components to stick to epoxy resin, so it could potentially come apart. Second thing you need to remember, and you'll see it right here in this pendant, is that Jesmonite is way heavier than epoxy resin. So when you are combining them both, as I am here, wet with wet, there is a tendency and a risk that the Jesmonite will take over and swamp out the epoxy resin. But because I'm using them in flat pendant pieces, it's really not an issue. The issue here is that I poured way too much pink. It took over the bottom of the pendant mold, and now the back of that pendant mold is going to be completely pink. The resin is not strong enough to move the Jesmonite back up the mold as if it would be if it was two resins going into one mold. I'm hoping that makes sense. Alternatively, you do need to think about it if you are adding wet with wet and you want to do, say, a layered pot. So if you want the top of your pot to be epoxy resin and you want the bottom to be Jesmonite, it will only work if the Jesmonite goes in while the resin is wet. But if the resin is too wet, the Jesmonite will sink down through the epoxy resin and take over your piece. So what my advice would be is to leave your epoxy resin sit for around 30 minutes, depending on resin. Let it sit for around 30 minutes until it has thickened up to the point where it's still tacky. It's still gonna stick to your Jesmonite when you pour it on the back. But if it's too runny, your Jesmonite will slip down in through it. I hope I'm making sense, but they are the two main tips. First tip being Jesmonite does not stick to resin. Resin sticks to Jesmonite. So it would always have to be Jesmonite first, followed by epoxy resin. You can do that dry or wet, it's entirely up to you. As long as the resin goes on second, you're good. It's gonna stick. And then the second tip is, of course, that Jesmonite is heavier than resin. You would have seen that in a video I did recently where I ended up adding a tattoo because I did not like the finish at all. The Jesmonite fell completely through the resin and just took over. Okay, back to the video. You can see here I'm just adding the combination of two, either the top half or like this one here, the bottom half, and just making sure that on each one I'm tapping them real good to get into those 90-degree angles, and then you can use a cocktail stick to go in and around and just brush out any potential trapped air bubbles. The one thing I will say is that I was already over the moon because I could not see a single bubble, not a single bubble. I fully expected bubble Armageddon. I fully expected the bubbles to be absolutely taking over this resin, and they weren't. So the fact that I left my resin to sit to the side for 10 to 15 minutes before pouring, I think was definitely a beneficial move. It really, really helped all of those bubbles surface. So yeah, a nice little tap, and I'm just filling them up until I'm happy, and we are good to go. As soon as I've pretty much got them where I want them, I'm just going in with some clear resin to fill the molds up. I don't want any resin to go over the edges because we all know I am not about that sanding life. It's not for me. So yeah, I'm just filling them up until I am happy, and really, honestly, I was just so happy at this point. I was so happy that the Terrazzo pieces themselves were not expelling thousands of bubbles. There are bubbles, yes, but I do end up going in with my torch here. Now you do need to be careful. I've got my torch on the lowest possible setting. You really don't want to use a blowtorch around molds this small, okay? It worked for me, but it doesn't always work. You can potentially actually melt your silicone. So just be very careful. I kind of knew what I was doing because I've done it before and it was fine, but just, yeah, be careful. Now, I did make too much Jesmonite. Making Jesmonite in small quantities is actually a lot harder than you might think. If you only want eight tiny little grams, 5 grams, 6 grams of Jesmonite, virtually impossible to make teeny tiny quantities. So I always have leftovers, therefore I always have molds to the side that I can pour my leftovers into. And off camera I was pouring in my Jesmonite that was left in my little cups just to use up every last little drop. Couldn't use the green because it set on me. It was particularly warm this day, but yeah, here we are. I'm just kind of panning over, but I do go back round. You can see that coral one needs a little bit more resin. I do go back in to make sure they are all happily where I want them to be. And this is the next day. Yes, my nails are quite destroyed by the Jesmonite and I've burnt my finger, so please excuse that. Oh, anyway, okay, here they are. Absolutely gorgeous results. I am loving them. They remind me of like really trendy alternative jewellery you might find in Camden or like, I don't know, Covent Garden somewhere. Really loving them. They are full of sunshine. There's two things here. I'm loving the contrast between the matte Jesmonite and the epoxy resin. However, I do believe they would benefit from a resin top coat just to bring them back to life, especially this one here, the coral. I got some air pockets trapped in and under that Terrazzo sprinkle. I could have foreseen it, but I didn't spend time playing around making sure to kind of de-trap, is that a word? De-trap any bubbles that potentially could have got caught. But this is really the only one where I got surface bubbles in the base. So yeah, a top coat of epoxy resin really would work with these. The green is my absolute favourite. I think the green pops so much more, which is a surprise. I thought the yellow would be. But yeah, you could top these with either UV resin or epoxy resin, you know, resin of choice. But I love the contrast between the matte and the actual gloss of the epoxy resin. I think that's the whole point in doing this. Otherwise, you might as well just use a neon epoxy and epoxy. Do you know what I mean? The other thing to mention is that the Jesmonite gives them a lot of weight because, as I said, it's heavier. So when you make a pendant with Jesmonite, it is 5 times heavier than an epoxy resin pendant. So that's another benefit of adding them together. But I'm overall really happy with the results. I do think the surfaces could be a little bit prettier. You know, they're a little bit scuffed, but that's me not looking after my molds properly. Tut. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. Let me know which colour is your favourite. Honestly, they just give me summer vibes. They make me smile. The whole point of this was to experiment. I've not tried it before, so I hope you found it helpful. If you are thinking of adding any Terrazzo chips into epoxy resin, I hope the hints and the tips that I've given you along the way of this process are going to be beneficial to you moving forward. So yeah, that's the whole point of this video. And if you're wondering why I went small, it's because I'm running out of space in my craft room. It's actually out of control. So when I do little experiments like this, it's easier for me to do them on a smaller scale than it is to create something absolutely huge that's going to take up yet another shelf. But yeah, here is the results of the coaster. I absolutely love it. Hundreds and thousands vibes for sure. Really happy with the results. A couple of little white bits crept in there without me realizing, but that's okay. But yeah, I'm really happy. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, do not forget to give me that like, hit that like button. Big thumbs up would be so much appreciated. And yeah, hit the subscribe also. If you are still here, we are nearly, what are we? We are nearly 13 minutes in, so thank you so much. If you're still here, hit that subscribe. The next video, I am going to be using those big, fat, chunky Terrazzo chips. Why is Terrazzo such a mouthful of a word to say? Anyway, the next video, I'm going to be using the big chunks that I made in the previous video, and I'm going to be putting them in epoxy resin, and we're going to see how that one turns out. So I hope you'll hang around to see that as well, and I really appreciate you all. Let me know which colour scheme is your favourite, and that is all from me. This voiceover has taken 8 attempts, so that's all. I'm going to end it here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!